Loch Ness holds more water than all the lakes in England and Wales combined. It stretches 23 miles through the Scottish Highlands, plunging to depths of nearly 800 feet. And if you ask most people what lives in this massive body of water, they won't mention salmon or pike. They'll tell you about a monster. But here's what's rarely discussed. The modern legend of the Loch Ness Monster is less than a century old. The image most people have in their minds, that long-necked plesiosaur emerging from dark waters, didn't exist in Scottish folklore for centuries. It appeared suddenly in the 1930s, and before that, the stories were entirely different. Medieval Scotland had its share of water legends, certainly. The Kelpie, a shape-shifting water horse that drowned travelers; the Echuiske, a malevolent creature of lochs and seas; Saint Columba, in the 6th century, supposedly encountered a beast in the River Ness and commanded it to retreat, a story often cited as the earliest Nessie sighting. But these creatures bore little resemblance to what we now call the Loch Ness Monster. They were supernatural beings, not biological animals. They were shapeshifters and demons, not prehistoric survivors. The ancient Scots weren't describing an unknown species. They were explaining drownings, disappearances, and the dangers of deep water through the lens of their mythology. So why did the monster suddenly transform in the 1930s from mythological entity to zoological possibility? Why did the descriptions shift from supernatural horse to prehistoric reptile? And why did this particular loch, among thousands in Scotland, become ground zero for one of the modern world's most persistent mysteries? The answer reveals less about what might be in the water and more about what was happening in the world above it. The evolution of sightings. In 1933, a new road was completed along the northern shore of Loch Ness, the A82. For the first time, the loch was easily accessible to tourists and motorists. Trees that had obscured the water for centuries were cleared, and suddenly people were looking at Loch Ness in a way they never had before. In April 1933, the Inverness Courier published an article about a local couple who claimed to have seen an enormous animal rolling and plunging on the surface. The newspaper editor made a crucial decision. He used the word monster, not creature, not an animal, monster. Within weeks, sightings exploded. The story went national, then international. London newspapers sent correspondents, photographers arrived, tourists flooded the area, all scanning the water, all hoping to witness something extraordinary. Then came the photograph that would define the legend. In April 1934, a London surgeon named Robert Kenneth Wilson produced what appeared to be a clear image of a long-necked creature emerging from the loch. The photograph was published worldwide. It became the defining image of the Loch Ness Monster, reproduced in thousands of books, articles, and documentaries. What's rarely mentioned is how small the object in the photograph actually was, probably no more than 2 or 3 feet tall based on water ripple analysis, or that Wilson himself never claimed to have photographed a monster, only something strange. Or that in 1994, one of the men involved in taking the photograph confessed on his deathbed that it was a hoax, a toy submarine with a sculpted head attached. But by then, it didn't matter. The image had already done its work. It had given people a template for what the Loch Ness Monster looked like. And here's where the pattern becomes fascinating. After 1934, witness descriptions began to converge. Before the surgeon's photograph, accounts varied wildly. Humps, dragon-like heads, eel-like bodies. After the photograph, people consistently described a plesiosaur, long neck, small head, large body. Witnesses weren't necessarily lying, but they were interpreting ambiguous stimuli, waves, logs, otters, boats, through the lens of an image they'd all seen. The photograph didn't capture the monster, it created the monster in the public imagination. Sightings peaked in the 1960s and 70s, when monster fever was at its height. Since then, despite better cameras, despite smartphones in every pocket, despite thousands more visitors each year, sightings have declined dramatically. The better our tools for documentation became, the fewer monsters people saw.
That inverse relationship between technology and sightings should tell us something important. Physical evidence and technology. If eyewitness testimony is unreliable, then surely physical evidence and modern technology could settle the question. And indeed, for decades, serious researchers have attempted exactly that. In 1962, the Loch Ness Investigation Bureau was established. For a decade, teams of volunteers conducted systematic surface watches, accumulating thousands of hours of observation. They documented unexplained wakes, unusual disturbances, and ambiguous sonar contacts, but nothing conclusive. Robert Rines and the Academy of Applied Science conducted multiple sonar expeditions in the 1970s, producing the famous flipper photographs, underwater images that appeared to show diamond-shaped appendages. These images generated tremendous excitement and were published in respectable journals. Later, computer analysis revealed that those images had been so heavily enhanced and retouched that they bore little resemblance to the original sonar data. What might have been debris or water distortion had been transformed through processing into something that looked biological. In 1994, Operation DeepScan deployed a flotilla of boats equipped with sonar across the entire width of Loch Ness, systematically sweeping the loch from shore to shore. If a large animal were present, this comprehensive survey should have detected it. They found 3 sonar contacts that couldn't be immediately explained, objects with strength and dimensions that didn't match known fish or debris. Adrian Shine, the expedition leader, was careful to note these were unidentified, not unidentifiable. Subsequent analysis suggested these contacts were most likely seal carcasses or large concentrations of fish. The loch is full of objects that produce unusual sonar returns, sunken trees, abandoned equipment, and geological formations. But the most comprehensive investigation came in 2018 and 2019. An international team of researchers conducted an environmental DNA survey, eDNA, collecting water samples from throughout the loch and analyzing them for genetic material from every living organism present. eDNA analysis is extraordinarily sensitive. Every creature that lives in, swims through, or even touches the water leaves behind genetic traces: skin cells, scales, waste, and mucus. This technique can detect species present in tiny numbers. It's so precise that it can identify individual fish species and estimate population sizes. And the results cataloged all expected species: pike, eels, salmon, and sticklebacks, and numerous invertebrates. They found eDNA from terrestrial animals that drink from the loch: deer, sheep, and dogs. They even found traces of human DNA. But what they didn't find was any genetic evidence of a large unknown vertebrate. No plesiosaur DNA, no unknown species, no large eel beyond what's already documented. Nothing. And so we arrive at a paradox. The 1930s through 1970s, when cameras were poor, when underwater equipment was primitive, when documentation was difficult, produced dozens of photographs, sonar contacts, and physical evidence claims. The 2000s and 2010s, with smartphones, high-definition cameras, advanced sonar, and eDNA, have produced virtually nothing. Better tools should reveal more, not less, unless what earlier generations were seeing wasn't there to begin with. The scientific problem. But let's set aside the evidence for a moment and ask a more fundamental question. Could Loch Ness support a large unknown animal population, not just one creature, but a breeding population necessary for a species to survive across centuries? Loch Ness was formed by glacial activity and became a freshwater lake approximately 10,000 years ago when it was cut off from the sea. For any large aquatic creature to be present today, it would need to have either been trapped when the loch was isolated from the ocean or have entered through rivers connecting to the sea. Plesiosaurs, the most commonly suggested identity for Nessie, went extinct 66 million years ago. They were marine reptiles that breathed air and would have needed to surface regularly. A population of air-breathing animals in a 23-mile-long loch could not remain undetected for decades, especially during the era of intensive surface observation in the 1960s. But the more fundamental problem is food. Biologists have thoroughly studied Loch Ness's ecosystem. The loch is actually relatively nutrient-poor, a characteristic of deep, cold, freshwater lakes. It supports an estimated biomass of fish, but not an enormous one. A single large predator weighing several tons would require hundreds of pounds of fish per day. A breeding population of such creatures, you'd need at least 10 to 20 individuals to maintain genetic diversity, would require tons of fish daily. The mathematics simply don't work. The loch's fish population could not sustain even a single large predator year-round without collapsing, and there's no evidence of unusual fish population dynamics that would suggest a major predator at work. Some have suggested giant eels as a more plausible explanation, especially since the eDNA study found significant eel DNA. But European eels are well studied. We know their life cycle, their maximum size, typically under 3 feet long, rarely approaching 5, and their breeding biology requires migration to the Sargasso Sea. Could there be an unknown species of massive freshwater eel? Biologically, it's not impossible, but it would need to have evolved in complete isolation in a lake that's only 10,000 years old, not nearly enough time for such dramatic speciation, and it still faces the food supply problem. Other isolated lakes, like Baikal in Russia or Tanganyika in Africa, do contain unique species, but these lakes are millions of years old, giving evolution time to work. And their unique species are thoroughly documented because they exist in stable, observable populations. The scientific consensus isn't just that there's no evidence for a large, unknown animal in Loch Ness. It's that the biology, ecology, and physics of the situation make such an animal's existence mathematically implausible, not merely unlikely, but incompatible with everything we know about population genetics, predator-prey relationships, and isolated freshwater ecosystems. Despite the scientific impossibility and the complete lack of evidence, the Loch Ness Monster refuses to die, and perhaps that's because the legend has become far too valuable to abandon. The Loch Ness Monster generates an estimated £41 million annually for the local economy. Thousands of jobs depend on visitors coming to see the loch, take boat tours, buy merchandise, and stay in hotels. The monster has become the region's most important economic asset, far more valuable alive as a legend than dead as a confirmed hoax. Walk into any shop in Inverness or along the loch, and you'll find Nessie everywhere. Cuddly toys, whiskey bottles, keychains, postcards. The creature has been transformed from cryptozoological mystery into lovable mascot, simultaneously treated as possibly real and definitely marketable. News media has played its role perfectly. Examine the pattern of Nessie stories in British newspapers over decades, and you'll notice something interesting. They appear with remarkable regularity during slow news periods, summer holidays, between major stories, when papers need content that's entertaining but requires minimal investigation. The formula is predictable. A new sighting is reported with appropriate mystery and excitement. Skeptical scientists provide counterarguments. The story runs for a few days, generating clicks and sales, then fades until the next sighting. The cycle repeats endlessly, and everyone involved benefits. Television and film have produced hundreds of Nessie documentaries and fictional depictions. Most follow the same structure: historical background, famous sightings, scientists searching, ambiguous evidence, no conclusion. This format works because the audience doesn't actually want resolution. Mystery is more entertaining than certainty. The internet has only amplified this dynamic. YouTube is filled with Nessie videos, most obviously showing waves, boats, or debris, but presented with ominous music and suggestive titles. Comment sections divide predictably between believers and skeptics, each group reinforcing the other's engagement. And here's what's rarely acknowledged: the relationship between believers and skeptics has become symbiotic.
Believers keep the legend alive, generating tourism and media interest. Skeptics provide the appearance of serious investigation, lending credibility to the search. Both sides need each other. Serious researchers like Adrian Shine, who've spent decades systematically studying the loch, acknowledge the lack of evidence while maintaining that proper scientific investigation is valuable regardless of outcome. But even they benefit from the legend's persistence. Funding, attention, and purpose come from the mystery itself. Local residents display the full spectrum of belief. Some genuinely think something unknown might inhabit the loch. Others roll their eyes at the tourists but appreciate the economic benefits. A few resent how their home has been reduced to a monster attraction. But almost no one actively tries to kill the legend, because the alternative, Loch Ness as just a lake, holds far less appeal. The Loch Ness Monster has evolved from zoological question to cultural institution. It's a shared fiction that generates real value. And that transformation reveals something uncomfortable. Sometimes we collectively choose to sustain belief in something we know isn't true because the alternative is less economically, culturally, or emotionally satisfying. The open question. So we return to the question, but not the one you might expect. The question isn't, does the Loch Ness Monster exist? Science has answered that as definitively as science ever does. No breeding population of large animals inhabits Loch Ness. No plesiosaur lurks in the depths. No giant eel awaits discovery. The real question is this: why, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, despite scientific impossibility, despite exposed hoaxes and failed searches, does the belief persist? What need does the Loch Ness Monster fulfill? We live in an age where mystery has become increasingly rare. Satellite imagery covers every square foot of Earth's surface. We've mapped ocean floors and summited every mountain. DNA analysis can identify species from a drop of water. The unknown shrinks daily. For most of human history, the world was full of unknown regions and undiscovered creatures. Dragons, sea serpents, and monsters weren't cryptozoology, they were geography. The edges of maps literally read, "Here be dragons." We still discover new species regularly: insects, deep-sea creatures, microorganisms. Occasionally we find a new mammal or bird, but we don't find large animals in accessible places anymore. The age of discovering megafauna is over. The Loch Ness Monster offers something psychological that mere reality cannot: the possibility that we haven't figured out everything, that nature still holds secrets, that the world remains large and mysterious despite our best efforts to catalog it. For children, Nessie represents pure imagination, a friendly dinosaur living in a Scottish lake. For adults, the meaning is more complex. It's nostalgia for a time when the world seemed bigger. It's resistance to the complete rationalization of nature. It's a small rebellion against a world that insists everything can be measured, explained, and dismissed. Science excels at explaining what is, but myths address what we wish could be. The Loch Ness Monster isn't a failure of critical thinking. It's a different kind of thinking, one concerned less with facts than with meaning, less with evidence than with narrative. And perhaps that's why the legend endures, because some part of us recognizes that a world completely explained is a world diminished. We need some mysteries, even artificial ones, to maintain a sense of wonder. Does this mean we should embrace comforting fictions over uncomfortable truths? Of course not. But it does mean we should ask ourselves what we lose when we insist on nothing but literal truth. What dies in us when the last mystery is explained? The Loch Ness Monster doesn't exist, but the human need for mystery does. And perhaps understanding that need, that hunger for something unexplained in an increasingly explained world, is more valuable than simply declaring believers foolish. Loch Ness is full of water, fish, and occasional seals. What it's empty of are monsters, but what it's full of, human imagination, projection, hope, and the stubborn refusal to accept that we've seen everything there is to see, that's worth examining. Because in the end, the Loch Ness Monster tells us nothing about what's in the water,
but it tells us everything about who we are. Conclusion. Thanks for joining this investigation into belief, mystery, and what we choose to see when we look at dark water. Here's the question for you. If tomorrow definitive proof emerged that nothing unusual has ever existed in Loch Ness, would the world be better or worse for that knowledge? Would we gain more from certainty than we lose from the death of wonder? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this kind of thoughtful exploration interests you, where we examine not just whether something is true, but why we want it to be true, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring this same analytical approach to mysteries, myths, and the stories we tell ourselves about the world. And if you're interested in more explorations of how belief shapes perception, check out our videos on Bigfoot, the Bermuda Triangle, or ancient alien theories. We're not here to tell you what to think. We're here to help you think more carefully about what you already believe. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, sometimes the most interesting question isn't whether something exists, but why we need it to.